Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to break down the sprawling, absolute behemoth that is World War II. But we're going to do it by zeroing in on the pivotal turning points that totally shifted the momentum. When you look at the sheer scale of the Second World War, it can be, frankly, overwhelming. We're talking about a conflict fought across oceans, blistering deserts, the skies, and freezing tundras. But to truly wrap our heads around how the war was won, we need to focus on those specific, game-changing moments where the tide definitively turned. So, you've got to ask yourself, how did a string of invincible Axis victories suddenly unravel? Well, let's dive right into this. We're going to look at how the early, rapid expansions by the Axis powers were ultimately completely dismantled by technological breakthroughs, raw industrial might, and some major strategic shifts. Back in the early 1940s, both Germany and Japan seemed utterly unstoppable, right? They were conquering territory at a blistering pace. Yet, within just a few years, their war machines were grinding to a halt, completely reversed by the Allies. How exactly did that happen? To make sense of this immense conflict, we'll structure our explainer theater by theater. First up, the Pacific Fleet awakens. Then, we'll head to the sands of North Africa. After that, strategic bombing and skies. Fourth, the Battle of the Atlantic. And finally, the Soviet juggernaut. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The Pacific Fleet awakens, Japan's overreach, and the American counterpunch. So, Japan firmly believed that an unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor would just completely destroy America's stomach for war, allowing them to pull off a swift Oriental blitzkrieg across Southeast Asia. They calculated, if they could just cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, a nation they viewed as pleasure lovers, they would quickly sue for peace. And honestly, initially, this strategy seemed incredibly successful.
Just look at how this builds. Following Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan launched a staggering wave of initial conquests. They swept through Malaya, famously forced the surrender of 90,000 troops at Singapore, and pushed the Americans right out of the Philippines. But underneath this surface of invincibility, a massive, vital shift was happening. Over in Hawaii, U.S. codebreakers were quietly intercepting and deciphering Japan's military communications. This was brilliant intelligence work, and it allowed the U.S. to anticipate Japanese movements. First, they blunted Japan's advance at the Battle of the Coral Sea, which, fun fact, was the first naval battle in history where opposing ships never actually laid eyes on each other, and that set the stage for a massive showdown. And that brings us to the crucial turning point, the Battle of Midway. By using a fake, uncoded message about a broken water system on Midway Island, the U.S. basically confirmed the exact target of Japan's next attack. It was a brilliant trap. The Japanese commander, Admiral Nagumo, took a high-stakes gamble on rearming his planes and was caught completely off guard by U.S. dive bombers. In a matter of mere minutes, literally just minutes, unnumbered American forces successfully sank all four of Japan's finest aircraft carriers. None survived. This permanently destroyed their mastery of the sea and broke their offensive momentum in the Pacific for good. Moving on to Section 2, Sands of North Africa, the Desert Fox versus Monty. Moving across the globe, Mussolini had this failing dream of a new Roman Empire in North Africa, and it forced Hitler to divert vital German troops under the command of Erwin Rommel. Mussolini really wanted to turn the Mediterranean into an Italian lake, but his forces were getting quickly routed by the British. So Hitler, very reluctantly but necessarily, had to send in his Afrika Korps to bail out his ally, kicking off one of the most famous tactical duels of the entire war. This perfectly illustrates the legendary tactical clash between these two commanders. Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, he relied on wide outflanking sweeps in the open desert, outgunning the British with his 88mm guns. But there was a major catch. His supply lines were completely starved of fuel. On the other side, General Bernard Montgomery took the exact opposite approach. He dug in at El Alamein, anchoring his line against the impassable Qatar Depression so he literally couldn't be outflanked. Then, flooded with fresh U.S. Sherman tanks and backing it up with massive artillery, Montgomery used sheer frontal attrition to smash through the Axis defenses. This forced a massive retreat and marked Germany's first major defeat by Western allies. But, the outcome in the desert was fundamentally dictated by logistics. Because the British successfully defended the island of Malta from the air, they were able to throttle Rommel's vital fuel supply lines. The Axis forces quite literally ran out of gas. Malta sits right in the middle of the Mediterranean, and it was relentlessly bombed by the Axis. But thanks to a desperate, heavily attacked convoy known as Operation Pedestal, just enough supplies got through to keep the island fighting. This allowed British forces to continuously sink Axis supply ships, basically leaving Rommel stranded in the desert without the fuel his tanks desperately needed. Okay, Section 3. Strategic Bombing and Skies, the controversial aerial war. Since they didn't have troops on the European mainland at the time, the Allies turned to the skies to strike directly at Germany's infrastructure and civilian morale. It was really the only way Britain could directly attack Hitler's fortress Europe. But exactly how to do it? Well, that was a matter of intense debate. What's really interesting here is the stark contrast in Allied aerial strategies. Early British attempts to hit specific targets were, well, wildly inaccurate. So under Arthur Bomber Harris, they switched to nighttime carpet bombing of entire cities to try and break civilian morale. They used Lancaster bombers and dropped this radar-jamming foil called Window to successfully blind German defenses. The Americans, meanwhile, took a totally different route. They believed their heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses could survive daylight raids to surgically take out specific factories and infrastructure, using their highly advanced Norden bomb sites. Now, Harris firmly believed he could bomb Germany into submission. He's quoted as saying, "There are a lot of people who say the bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet. And while raids like the apocalyptic firebombing of Dresden resulted in 50,000 civilian deaths, it objectively failed to break German morale. It essentially proved that air power alone lacked the final knockout blow. Despite the massive destruction and loss of life, German war production actually increased for much of the war, and the civilian population didn't rise up to surrender. It drastically disrupted infrastructure for sure, but it couldn't win the war on its own." That brings us to Section 4, Battle of the Atlantic, defeating the U-boat menace. Down below the skies, Britain's survival completely, 100% depended on overseas supplies. This made Hitler's U-boat fleets the absolute most dangerous threat to the Allied war effort during their early happy time. In those early years, German U-boats were hunting in wolf packs and just devastating Allied shipping. They were sinking merchant ships at an alarming rate, literally threatening to starve Britain of food, oil, and weapons. But the U-boats were ultimately defeated, not by massive battleships, but by a very specific list of technological breakthroughs that flipped the script and turned the hunters into the hunted. First, centimetric radar. It was small enough to fit on planes to catch surfacing subs at night. Then you had HFDUF, or high-frequency direction finding, which allowed ships to instantly triangulate U-boat radio chatter. There was the Hedgehog, which fired dozens of mortars ahead of a ship rather than dropping them blindly behind. And, absolutely crucially, capturing an Enigma machine from a sinking U-boat allowed Allied codebreakers to read German naval communications, predicting wolfpack movements and routing convoys safely around them. A real game changer. Securing the ocean was the absolute prerequisite for liberating Europe. The toll was heavy. 75% of German U-boat crews perished, but it finally cleared the lanes for the American military machine. Once the U-boat threat was neutralized, the Atlantic basically became an Allied highway. Victory here allowed great waves of U.S. troops and equipment to flood across the ocean. Without this vital victory, the D-Day landings and the massive influx of soldiers that ultimately liberated Western Europe would have been mathematically impossible. Section 5. The Soviet Juggernaut, the staggering scale of the Eastern Front. While the Western Allies fought at sea and in the air, the sheer, unimaginable scale of the ground war was being decided in Russia. It is almost impossible to overstate just how massive and brutal the fighting was in the East. This wasn't just a war, this was a war of absolute annihilation. Look at how these numbers visualize the brutal math of the Eastern Front. By 1944, the Red Army had a staggering 6 million active troops on the line, double the manpower of the Germans, who were sitting at under 3 million. And Hitler? He made it worse by constantly overriding his generals with fanatical no-retreat orders. Whenever a German army was threatened with encirclement, like in Kharkov or the Korsun Pocket, Hitler would declare it a fortified area and strictly forbid any tactical withdrawal. The result was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of seasoned German troops were unnecessarily surrounded and systematically shredded by the Red Army. 2,000. That is the staggering number of battle-tested T-34 tanks that rolled out of Siberian factories every single month. Every single month. It made Germany's defeat an inescapable industrial fact. You see, while Germany was producing highly engineered, complicated tanks like the Tiger and Panther, they simply couldn't make enough of them. The Soviet Union basically picked up and mobilized its entire population behind the Ural Mountains and churned out T-34s at an industrial scale that Germany couldn't even begin to fathom. But we have to remember, Stalin's ultimate goal was territory. As the massive Soviet offensive, Operation Bagration, utterly ripped the heart out of the German army, they pushed right up outside Warsaw. But instead of aiding the Polish Home Army's uprising, Stalin actually ordered his troops to halt. By waiting there, he intentionally allowed the Nazis to crush the pro-Western Polish resistance fighters. It was a cold, calculated move that objectively cleared the way for a post-war Soviet puppet government by removing their biggest political obstacle. So as you reflect on all these facts, I want to lead you with this question. Did the defeat of the Axis powers simultaneously lay the immediate groundwork for the Cold War? Consider how Stalin's tactical land grabs across Eastern Europe not only ended one global conflict, but immediately ignited the next one right away. As the Red Army marched toward Berlin, they didn't just liberate territory, they occupied it. The end of World War II saw the destruction of fascism, yes, but the very way it was fought and the strategic decisions made on the ground literally drew the borders for the Cold War that would define the next half-century. It's a powerful reminder of how the closing of one chapter in history is almost always the opening of another. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the facts, and I'll catch you next time.